The phone hadn't rung in nearly a year, and when it did, it wasn't him. I'd stopped hoping for the sound of his voice, but a father's heart is like a cracked bell damaged, yet still aching to be struck. My name is Walter Grant. I'm 74 years old, and until recently, I believed loneliness was just part of aging. Aches in the knees, pills on the counter, and silence in every room. But I've learned there are worse things than being old and alone. There's betrayal. There's being forgotten by your only son. And then there's what happens when he comes back. Let me start with the last time I saw Daniel me boy, my blood. It was a March morning, cold and gray, the kind that sinks into your bones and reminds you you're closer to the end than the beginning. I was sitting by the window, watching the street from my worn recliner, when he stepped out the door with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. No hug. No, I'll call you later, Dad. Just a slammed door and the sting of words he didn't say. That was 3 years ago. Back then, I still believed time could fix things. I sent messages, left voicemails, birthdays, holidays, the anniversary of his mother's passing. I reached out. I held on to the idea that silence was just space he needed. But space stretched into absence, and absence became abandonment. I sold the house that held too many memories and bought this modest one-bedroom near the edge of town. The kind of place no one drives by unless they're lost or delivering something. It suited me. Quiet, unnoticed, forgotten, until the hospital stay last winter. I collapsed while taking out the trash. Woke up in a sterile room with a nurse adjusting my four and a social worker asking if I had any family to call. My answer was a bitter smile and a lie. No one. Because admitting the truth hurt worse than the chest pains. I recovered. Barely. But something changed in me. I didn't want pity. I didn't want anyone looking at me like I was someone waiting to die. So, I started writing letters. Not to him but to myself. To my wife, Martha. To the version of Daniel that used to sit on my shoulders and laugh like the world was a playground. And I began planning. Because if life had taught me anything, it was this. Blood may bind us, but it doesn't guarantee loyalty. And love, if unreturned, will rot into something else entirely. Then, last week, the doorbell rang. He stood there like a ghost that had aged in all the wrong ways. Suit jacket too nice for a casual visit. Eyes darting behind me like he was already counting the walls and windows. "Hey, Dad," he said, voice smooth as always. "Mind if I come in?" I stared. 1,000 nights waiting for him to say those words, and when they finally came, they tasted like ash. But I smiled. I opened the door. "Of course," I said. "It's been a while." Inside, he looked uncomfortable, as if the furniture judged him. I offered coffee, and he accepted, though I noticed he didn't drink it. Then came the line I had rehearsed in my head so many times it had become a reflex. "What brings you by, son?" He shifted, cleared his throat. "Heard you weren't doing too well." "Oh." I raised an eyebrow. He didn't look me in the eye. "A friend saw something online. Some obituary mix-up. Thought it was you." "Interesting." No mention of missed birthdays or hospital stays. Just an algorithm-driven guilt trip. "Well," I said, "you can see I'm very much alive." He nodded. "Yeah, that's good." Silence stretched between us like barbed wire. I could almost feel the ticking clock in his head, waiting for the right moment to get to the point. He didn't disappoint. "So you ever finished that while you were working on?" he asked casually. Too casually. And there it was. Not concern, not love, just the cold gleam of expectation. I leaned back, let the question hang in the air. "You remember that old safe I used to keep in the garage?" I asked instead. He blinked. "Oh yeah? The one with the rusty lock." I smiled. "I replaced it. Got a new one installed. Much more secure." He laughed awkwardly. "Good idea." I didn't mention that the new safe wasn't in the garage, or that the contents of my will had changed drastically since last year. That part would come later. For now, I let him believe what he came to believe. He stayed the night. Slept on the couch, phone always within reach. The next day, I caught him snooping in my desk drawers. He muttered something about looking for batteries. I said nothing. Let him. Because I had more important things to do. That afternoon, I made a visit to the lawyer. Finalized the documents. Left very specific instructions. And mailed a key not to him, but to someone else. Someone he didn't even know existed yet. You see, after the hospital, I started volunteering at the community center. Reading to kids. Helping folks fill out job applications. Most just came and went. But there was one Buluiswo stayed late, every time. bright, curious, kind. He reminded me of Daniel when he was 10, before ambition became currency. His mother worked 2 jobs, barely scraping by. His father? Gone. Just like Daniel's would have been if I hadn't stuck around. So I started helping. Quietly. An envelope here. A ride there. Nothing flashy. Just what I could. And I saw in Luis what I had once seen in my own son promise. Hope. Fire. But unlike Daniel, Luis never asked for anything. And maybe that's why I wanted to give him everything. I made him the sole heir. I left Daniel a letter. He wouldn't find it until after the funeral, of course. By then, I'd be ashes in a jar on the windowsill, and he'd be opening the safe he assumed was stuffed with property deeds and bank accounts. What he'd find instead was truth. And maybe, if there's still some sliver of soul inside him, regret. But I don't write this out of vengeance. I write it because people think the elderly fade quietly. They don't. Some of us go out whispering, others screaming, but some we go out writing our own ending. And mine begins with a boy who walked away, and ends with one who stayed. Daniel stayed for more days. Each morning, I made us breakfast, just like I used to when he was a boy. Scrambled eggs, 2 slices of toast, and coffee with too much sugar. He barely touched it. He was waiting. I could see it in the way he kept circling the living room, glancing at the bookshelf, the old file cabinet I never locked, the drawer where he probably thought I kept the will. He didn't ask outright again. That would have made him look greedy. But he lingered in every corner of the house like a man trying to memorize a map he hadn't walked in years. I almost admired his patience. Almost. You still talk to anyone from church? He asked on the second evening. I chuckled. Haven't been in a while. He nodded, stared at the window. You used to drag me there every Sunday. I looked at him carefully. I never dragged you. You used to hold my hand the whole way there. He didn't respond. There were these moments, fleeting but sharp, where his armor cracked. He would glance at the old clock on the mantel, the one Martha insisted we keep even though it ran 5 minutes slow, and for a second, he seemed like he wanted to ask about her, to say her name. But he never did. Instead, he brought up the car. You still have that Buick? The old one. Sold it last year. Shame, he said. Could have fixed it up. I didn't tell him I sold it to pay for Luis's computer. That night, I watched him stand in the hallway, staring at the photo of Martha holding a toddler Daniel on the beach. The boy in the photo was laughing, wrapped in a blue towel. She was sunburned, her hair windblown. That picture used to sit in the kitchen until the sunlight faded it. He didn't know I had it reprinted. He didn't ask why it was there. Maybe he didn't need to. I didn't ask what he did for work now. He offered nothing. Only mentioned something vague about consulting. The kind of term people use when they want you to stop asking questions. On the 5th day, he finally cracked. I could help you manage things, he said over lunch. Bills, accounts, paperwork. You know, in case anything happens. There it was. The pitch. I nodded slowly. I appreciate that, son. But I already have someone helping me. He blinked. Who? I smiled. Friend from the community center. Bright kid. Keeps me on track. He stiffened. You're trusting a stranger with your affairs? Not a stranger, I said. He's like family. I saw the flash in his eyes: shock, confusion, anger. It passed quickly, but not before it scorched whatever was left between us. You barely know him, he said. And yet, I replied, he shows up. He didn't say anything after that. That evening, he packed his things. I didn't ask him to stay. He didn't offer to come back. At the door, he paused. Is there anything you want me to know? I looked at him for a long time. Really looked. The man in front of me was no longer the boy I raised, the boy I stayed up late tutoring, the boy who broke his arm climbing the neighbor's tree and begged me not to tell his mom. This man wore ambition like armor. But beneath it, I wasn't sure there was much left. I placed a hand on his shoulder. Yes, I said. You should know I'm not afraid anymore. He frowned. Afraid of what? Of being alone. He left without another word. I sat back down in my chair. The house didn't feel heavier. It felt lighter. 3 days later, Luis and his mother came over. I showed them the letter, the documents, the lockbox. I had Luis read everything twice. His mother cried, quietly, into a folded tissue. You don't have to do this, she whispered. I know, I said. That's why I'm doing it. Weeks passed. Summer rolled in slowly. The heat settled like dust in every corner of the house, and my body began reminding me of things I didn't want to know. Nights grew longer. My legs ached. I forgot things. One afternoon, I left the kettle on and nearly set the stove ablaze. The fire alarm screamed for help I didn't have. Luis started coming by more often. He'd bring groceries, help clean up, sit with me while we watched old baseball reruns. He never asked questions. He just listened. "You ever miss your son?" he asked one night, carefully. I thought about lying. "Instead," I said, "I miss the boy he was, not the man he became." Luis didn't respond, just nodded slowly, eyes soft with understanding far too old for 14. That night, I wrote the final letter. Not to Daniel, but to Martha. "My dearest Martha, it's strange, writing you after all these years. I talk to you every day, in whispers, in sighs, in the silence between thoughts. But putting it down on paper feels different. I saw him again. He came back, but not for me. You would have known the second he walked through the door how his voice curled just a bit too smooth, how his eyes never stopped moving. You were always better at reading people. He looked like you, Martha. I hadn't noticed before. The same arch in the eyebrows, the same way he fidgets with his sleeves when he's nervous. I wanted to believe he came back because he missed me, because somewhere in that hardened adult version of himself, there was still that little boy who used to beg for one more bedtime story. But he didn't. He came for the scraps. I gave him none. I wish I could say that broke my heart. But truth be told, I think it set me free. I'm tired, love. Bone tired. But I'm not afraid. You always said the most important legacy we leave behind isn't in bank accounts or real estate, but in kindness, in love, in who we choose when we're given nothing in return. I've chosen Martha, and I think you'd be proud. Walter. When the end finally came, it was quiet. I was in my chair, the same one Daniel used to curl into as a child. Luis had just left for the evening, promising to bring over a chess set next time. My favorite jazz record was spinning low in the background. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in years, I dreamed of the ocean. Martha was there, barefoot in the sand, her dress dancing in the wind. She turned and smiled, arms open, and I ran to her. When Daniel returned, the house was locked. He'd heard the news lay through an old neighbor who still read the obituary section like a prayer list. The funeral had passed. No service, no announcements, just ashes scattered over the cliff Martha loved. He arrived with a suitcase and a plan. Inside, everything was untouched, except for the safe. It sat in the bedroom, exactly where I'd told him it would be. He cracked it open like a treasure chest. Inside, he found a sealed envelope, a faded photo of him and Martha at the beach, a small tin box with his name engraved on it, and a single gold ring-me wedding band. The letter read, "Daniel, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. There's no need to pretend this is a surprise. You came back for something, and now you've found it. But not the way you wanted. There's no inheritance here, no keys to properties, no checks to cash. What I had, I gave to someone who reminded me what love looks like. You had years. Years to show up, to call, to care. But you chose distance. You chose silence. You chose yourself. I don't blame you for leaving. But I hope someday, when the noise fades, you'll understand what you lost. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find a way back to the boy you once were. Until then, take this ring. It belonged to a man who stayed. Maybe it'll remind you what that means." "Dad." Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, letter in hand, staring at the ring in his palm. The silence in the house was deafening. He'd come for a fortune, but found something far heavier. Legacy, loss, and the ghost of a man who finally found peace. The days after the funeral were a haze for Daniel. He stayed in the house, but not out of grief, more like confusion, like someone who had traveled miles for gold only to find an empty well and a note that said, "You should have come sooner." He wandered through the rooms like a stranger, touched nothing, changed nothing. He ate the canned food Walter had left behind, slept on the lumpy couch, and kept rereading the letter until the paper grew soft from wear. He thought about selling the place. He even looked up realtors. But something kept him from picking up the phone. He'd stare at the wedding ring his father left him, turning it over in his hand, as if waiting for it to speak. It never did. He finally opened the small tin box Walter had left. Inside, there was a folded paper and a flash drive. The paper had just one sentence. "If you really want to know who I became without you, press play." Daniel hesitated for hours. Then he plugged it into his laptop. It was a video. The frame opened on Walter sitting in his old recliner, wearing a faded blue sweater Daniel vaguely remembered from his childhood. His hair was thinner, his hands more veined, but his eyes were sharp, clear. Walter leaned forward and spoke into the camera, not angry, not bitter, just tired. If you're watching this, Daniel, it means you came back too late. He sighed, rubbed his forehead. I don't say that to hurt you, but I won't lie either. I waited. I hoped. I wanted to believe there was still a version of you that remembered Sunday pancakes and how I taught you to ride a bike without training wheels because you refused to be just like the other kids. But the silent sight broke something in me. Not all at once. It was slow, like rust on metal. You don't notice until one day the whole thing collapses. I survived a lot, Daniel. Losing your mother was the worst of it. But the second worst was realizing my son had let me become invisible. He paused, looked down for a long moment before raising his head again. But then something unexpected happened. A boy came into my life, a stranger, and he saw me, not as a burden or a bank account or a relic, just a man who still had something to give. And I gave it. You want to know why I left it all to him? He leaned closer to the camera. Because he stayed. The screen faded to black. Daniel stared for a long time. Then he slammed the laptop shut and cursed into the empty room. Punched the armrest. Kicked the coffee table until it wobbled. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had made the trip. He had shown up. That should have counted for something. He sat in the dark until morning. 2 days later, he drove across town. He hadn't planned to go. Had no idea what he would say. But curiosity, or guilt, or something uglier pulled him to the address listed on one of Walter's envelopes. It was a modest apartment complex. He climbed the stairs and knocked. A boy answered. Thin, wide-eyed, a little too serious for his age. Luis. Daniel asked. The boy nodded. Who are you? Daniel paused. I was Walter's son. The boy's eyes changed. Something passed through them, recognition, maybe, or judgment. Then he opened the door wider and let him in. The place was small, but clean. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting soft stripes across the carpet. A framed photo of Luis and Walter sat on the shelf, both of them smiling, holding a chessboard between them. He talked about you sometimes, Luis said, sitting on the couch. But not much. Daniel stayed standing. I didn't come here for anything, he said quickly. I wanted to understand. Luis looked up. Understand what? Daniel gestured vaguely at the space between them. Why him? Why not me? Luis tilted his head, as if trying to decide how honest to be. Then he said you forgot how to listen, that you started treating people like steps instead of stories. Daniel swallowed hard. Was he a good man to you? Luis nodded. The best I ever met. Silence again. Then Daniel asked, do you think I could be like him? Again, I mean. Luis didn't smile, but he didn't look away. I think you'd have to start by staying. That night, Daniel didn't return to his hotel. He drove back to Walter's house, sat in the driveway, turned the ring over in his fingers. Then he opened the trunk and carried his bag back inside. He stayed. Daniel began returning Walter's books to the library. Slowly, one by one. He kept a few, mostly the ones with notes in the margins. He planted tomatoes in the small patch of garden Walter had abandoned, repaired the sagging fence, fixed the broken porch light. Luis came by sometimes. They didn't talk about Walter much, but they played chess on the same board from the photo. At first, Daniel lost every game, but he kept playing. The silence between them began to fill with something other than regret. One afternoon, Luis brought over a stack of old notebooks. Walter told me to give you these, but only if you came back a second time. Daniel stared at them. He really said that? Luis nodded. He said if you came once, it might be guilt. But if you came twice, it might be something real. Daniel opened the first notebook. His father's handwriting filled every page. Letters, memories, advice, bits of wisdom scribbled like breadcrumbs for a lost man. He read for hours and cried for the first time in years. The transformation was slow. Daniel didn't become a saint overnight. He had to face everything he'd tried to outrun. The missed calls, the holidays he'd skipped, the father who had once driven 8 hours just to surprise him at college, only to be told, "This isn't a good time, Dad." But with every letter he read, every story he heard from Luis, something inside him shifted. He began volunteering at the center. At first, it was just sorting canned goods, then reading to kids, then helping them write college essays. People didn't know who he was, didn't care. They just saw a man who showed up. And for the first time in his life, Daniel began to understand what that meant. On the first anniversary of Walter's passing, Daniel stood at the cliffside where the ashes had been scattered. He carried no flowers, only the wedding ring, looped onto a chain around his neck. The wind whipped through his jacket, cold and biting. But he didn't flinch. He whispered, "I'm sorry, Dad." Then, after a long silence, he added, "But I'm still here." And he was. Daniel started keeping a journal. Not because he liked writing. He hated it, actually. But one of the notebooks Walter had left behind had a line scrawled in the corner of a page. "Write it down, son. What you don't say will become what you regret." So he wrote. At first, it was aimless. July 12th got up late. Replanted the tomatoes. Found Dad's old watch under the sink. Still works. I don't know why that made me cry. Then the entries deepened. July 15th, Luis beat me again. 3 times. I think he lets me win a few pawns just to be nice. The kid's sharp. Smarter than I was at his age. Dad saw that. Why didn't I? July 18th, dreamed about Dad. He was younger. Healthier. He looked disappointed but didn't say a word. Just walked away. I woke up gasping. July 20th, volunteered at the center. Helped a boy named Marcus write a scholarship letter. Told him to speak from the heart. Then realized I've never really done that myself. It became a nightly ritual. Write. Reflect. Try again tomorrow. Some days were better than others. Some days he hated himself. Some days he allowed a little forgiveness in. One afternoon, Luis showed up with a shoebox. Inside were more of Walter's things, a mix of photos, receipts, even a small cassette recorder. "I found this under my bed," Luis said. "He told me I'd know the right time to give it to you." Daniel turned the recorder over. There was a single tape inside, labeled in neat block letters. "For Daniel, if you stay." His hands trembled as he pressed play. Walter's voice was thinner, raspier, but unmistakably his. "If you're hearing this, then something I didn't dare hope for happened. You stayed. I wasn't always a good man. I was strict. I pushed you too hard sometimes. After your mother died, I think I forgot how to talk to you without sounding like I expected you to break. I didn't mean to harden you, but I did. Still, I waited for you to come back. Not just physically, but with your heart. And if you're listening now, maybe you did. This house, this town, these rooms, they were never the point. You were. You always were. I forgive you, Daniel. I only hope you can forgive me too. And if you can't not yet, then do this. Forgive yourself first." There was a pause. A deep inhale. "I loved you. No matter how far you wandered. That never changed." The tape clicked off. Daniel sat for a long time with his eyes closed. That night, he wrote in his journal. July 26th, "I thought I needed to make up for the years I lost. But I think maybe all I can do now is show up for the years ahead. That's enough. I hope it's enough." Time kept moving. The tomatoes ripened. The chess games continued. The world didn't stop for Daniel's grief or his redemption. But something subtle shifted. Neighbors who once avoided Walter's old house began waving at Daniel. A woman from the community center invited him to a block party. He almost declined. Then he remembered Luis saying, "He stayed, Daniel. That's why he mattered." So Daniel went. He brought lemonade and a plate of cookies he'd burned on the first batch. No one seemed to mind. He laughed, listened, shared a story about Walter helping a boy fix his bike with duct tape and blind faith. He watched the sun set behind the trees and thought, maybe this is what Dad meant by legacy. Not money, not property, but presence. Weeks later, a letter arrived. Handwritten. No return address. It was from the lawyer who'd handled Walter's estate. Inside was a final addendum. One Walter must have filed before his passing, to be delivered only under one condition. Daniel remained involved at the center for more than 30 days after Walter's death. The condition had been met. The note was brief. "Daniel, if you're reading this, it means you chose to stay longer than grief demanded. So I'll leave you this house. Not as a gift, but as a responsibility. Make it more than it was. Make it something someone will remember." Attached was the signed deed. Daniel folded the letter slowly, his throat thick. It wasn't about inheritance anymore. It never had been. It was about trust. And now, it was his to uphold. He didn't tell anyone about the deed for weeks. He simply got to work. Repainted the walls. Turned Walter's old room into a lending library for kids in the neighborhood. Left the recliner by the window untouched. Reupholstered, but the same chair. Luis helped him build a small bench out front with a brass plate that read, "For those who stayed." When people asked who Walter Grant was, Daniel didn't say my father first. He said, a man who saw people. A man who chose love over legacy. The day Daniel spoke at the center's fundraiser, he wasn't nervous. He stood behind the podium, hands steady, voice clear. I used to think inheritance was about what you get, he said. Now I know it's about what you give. Walter Grant gave me the chance to start again. I didn't deserve it, but I stayed. And that changed everything. The crowd stood, clapped. Luis beamed from the front row. Daniel didn't cry. Not that night. He waited until he got home, sat in Walter's chair, and whispered, I hope you saw that. And maybe, just maybe, he did. The second year after Walter's death began not with silence, but with music. Luis had picked up the trumpet. He practiced every afternoon on the front porch while Daniel sat beside him in the old recliner. They'd finally moved outside. The house no longer looked like a place for ghosts. The garden was blooming. The paint on the fence had chipped from weather, but Daniel repainted it every few months, the same shade of off-white Walter had chosen decades ago. People came by, not to stare or gossip anymore, but to talk, to sit, to rest. The neighborhood had changed. Or maybe Daniel had. He wasn't the man who had walked back into his father's house looking for a payday. That man had been hollow, running on memory and shame. This version of Daniel's lower, grayer, and still learning woke up every day trying to give instead of take. He hadn't heard from anyone in the family since the obituary ran. Not that there were many left. His cousins never wrote, and his Aunt Walter's sister had passed quietly 2 winters ago. Her funeral had been sparse. Daniel was one of 5 people there. At the gravesite, the pastor read a passage from Psalms, and Daniel caught himself glancing at the sky. The wind was soft, and the moment strangely peaceful. He whispered, You were right, Dad. There's something about showing up. Daniel began tutoring teens from the local high school. Math, mostly. Writing when they let him. He still kept the journals, each volume thicker than the last. He filled them with quotes from Walter's letters, entries from his own thoughts, and sometimes messages to his younger self. You missed birthdays and Thanksgivings, but you don't have to miss what's still ahead. Get up, cook something, call someone, stay human. There's a difference between guilt and grief. One drags you backward. The other asks you to walk forward with something heavier in your chest. Forgiveness isn't a door someone else opens. It's a window you break open yourself just to let light in. He let Luis read one of the journals. The boy returned it a week later with a single comment. You should publish this. Daniel laughed at first, but the idea stayed. He began compiling the journals, carefully editing them down into something raw but coherent. He included Walter's voice quotes from the letters and recordings. He titled the collection, The Years I Didn't Call, A Son's Journal of Loss, Regret, and Redemption. It wasn't flashy. It didn't go viral, but it made its way into the right hands. A small indie publisher picked it up, and within months, Daniel found himself standing in front of a microphone at a bookstore reading excerpts to a small but rapt audience. He read the final letter Walter had written, the one about staying, about legacy. When he finished, there were tears. Not just his. Afterward, a woman in her 60s approached him and said, I haven't spoken to my daughter in 7 years. I think I'm going to call her. That night, Daniel wrote in his journal, If I've done one good thing, just one, maybe it was helping someone else stay. In the spring of his 4th year at Walter's house, Daniel met Claire. She ran a small cafe near the library. Smart. Fierce. She wore grief like an old sweater, well worn, but no longer suffocating. Her husband had died 5 years prior. Cancer. Quietly cruel. They met through a community cleanup project, bonded over pruning shrubs, and arguing about whether geraniums were lazy flowers. Luis liked her. That helped. She didn't try to fix him, and he didn't try to explain himself. They just fit. They went slowly. Dinner on Fridays. Chess on Sundays. She beat him once and refused a rematch. One evening, over coffee, she asked, Did your father ever meet me in his stories? Daniel smiled. No, but he made space for you. That was enough. Luis turned 18 on a rainy Saturday in October. Daniel baked him a lopsided chocolate cake and gave him a new backpack and a book of handwritten letters Walter had addressed to the young man who stayed. Luis cried quietly when he read them. Daniel did too. That night, after the guests left, Luis stood on the porch, looking out at the street. I'm thinking of going away for college, he said. Daniel's heart jumped, but he didn't let it show. You should, he said. Get out there. Be loud. Luis looked down. What if I leave and forget to come back? Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. Then I'll remind you, he said, because someone reminded me once. And it changed everything. The night before Luis left for college, he gave Daniel a framed photo. It was the same picture of young Daniel and Martha on the beach, but restored, retouched, cleaned of years and time. Luis had found the original in a photo album and had it restored as a surprise. Daniel stared at it, overwhelmed. Luis said, "It's your beginning. You should hang it where you can see it." He did, right above the front door, so that every time he left the house, and every time he came home, he'd be reminded. This was where it started. And now, it's where it continues. 10 years after Walter's passing, Daniel stood before a new group of volunteers at the community center. He was older now, hair completely gray, eyes tired, but still holding that quiet light. He spoke to them the way Walter once spoke to him, in truths, not performances. He said, "There's no perfect way to make peace with the past, but you can live in a way that makes your future proud of you. Show up, stay, listen. Those are the things that outlast money and reputation. If you're lucky enough to love someone, say it before the silence grows teeth." Afterward, a young man named Elijah approached him. "You talk like someone who's lived through hell," Elijah said. Daniel smiled. "No, I lived through silence, and I let it become hell." Elijah nodded. "So how'd you get out?" Daniel looked around the room, full of hope and scraped knees and second chances. "I stayed." Epilogue. A decade after Daniel's book was published, a copy found its way into a prison library in Montana. A man serving a 15-year sentence for armed robbery read it in a single night. He hadn't spoken to his father in 12 years. The next morning, he wrote him a letter. 2 weeks later, a reply came. Just 3 words. "I'm still here." Legacy is strange. It isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with medals or money or names etched in stone. Sometimes, legacy is a house that blooms again, a bench under a tree that remembers, a journal left in the hands of a boy who knows how to listen. And sometimes, if you're lucky, legacy is simply this: a son who came home and stayed.